Thanks, Linda. I'd like to welcome everybody to Growing Concerns for May the 22nd. And we've had a busy week this past week. We've had a fair bit of crop go in the ground. We've had some moisture in some areas, and we've had some issues come up. So I guess the plan today is we're going to start again with a little bit of a crops update. We have Holly Derksen on and been getting a few questions regarding the value of cereal seed treatments as we're getting closer to the end of May and soil temperatures warm up. So I thought it'd be a good opportunity for Holly to maybe talk some of the benefits. And then John Gavloski is going to be on as well, as we have some of the crops starting to emerge, and if we're seeing any insect issues out there, especially the ones that can be controlled with seed treatments, and then maybe just a bit about flea beetles. After that, every year we get a bunch of trees that come in and from PFRA, and we're lucky to have Carol Graham on today. And she's going to give us some tips for planting these trees this spring, and then we'll end off the day with Weed of the Week for this week. So I guess with that, going to get right into the presentation. I guess just wanted to start off a bit. I was out in the Assiniboine Valley area the last couple of days, and even though a lot of guys are getting a lot of the crop in most of Manitoba, there's still a lot of water to be on that cropland, as you can see from the pictures. And this is directly north of Oak Lake, and right on the Harrison Bridge Road. So you can see there's lots of water still there. These guys are probably not looking at seeding probably to the the mid to end of June if the water goes down by then. So some areas are still having some water issues for sure. This one here is taken from the Assiniboine Valley, just north of Alexandra on Highway 250. So that area there as well as this is all cropland, and actually this field here I think was sown into winter wheat, because you could just see on the edge here where you could actually see some rows yesterday when I was out there. So you could see that there was a crop planted there last fall. So I guess with that and mentioning winter wheat, I'm going to talk a little bit about winter wheat again. It seems to be the issue for the last few webinars, and what I've been dealing with over the last week quite a bit. And I put down here as this being my last comments on winter wheat survival, because it's, don't want it to sound like a broken record, but just over this past week here in Southwest and South Parkland area anyways, there's been a lot of winter wheat fields being written off by MASC, and going out there and doing some counts with producers and looking at fields. We are in areas where we were getting counts of under 10 plants per square foot, and in some areas you were down to 0. So, definitely not enough to make a crop. One of the things we were seeing is even some of the stuff that was growing this spring was starting to die off as well, and probably because of the long drawn-out spring here with cold, and those seedlings just didn't have enough energy to keep going, and eventually just started to die off, and you can see that in the picture there. One good thing is the field I was following in Souris here actually is going to be reseeded. So the field that Elmer's following in the Shoal Lake area, this is a picture from last week's webinar, and as we remember from the week before this, there was actually just black dirt here. So you could see last week it was starting to green up, and then you look at it this week. So Elmer's been able to keep on top of that and get us some pictures. So that's going to be interesting to see how it goes throughout the year, but definitely looks like the winter wheat crop there is going to make it. And just a picture of another angle, and with the winds we've been having this past week, you can definitely see that it's been whipping the plants, but there definitely is a population there, and so it looks like that field's going to make it. So that's good to hear on that part. So a little bit about the crop update and what's happened over the past week, and we're probably roughly in that 60% of the cereal crop being planted in southwest and south parkland. It's going to vary a fair bit. Some areas are definitely a lot lower than this, probably in that 20%, but we also have some areas as we get farther west to the Saskatchewan border where a lot of those guys were a lot higher, and probably in that 70 to 80% done, and probably higher on their canola crop as well. Probably some of them are at 50% of their canola crop in as well. And you get down south too into that Killarney area, there's those percentages are definitely a lot higher. But these are averages kind of for the whole area, and so we got about 15% of the canola crop planted right now, and it's been going into a good soil moisture, and the rain that we got is definitely going to be helping those areas, especially for germination. About 45% of the corn crop planted, and around here it's been guys have been trying to get it in as fast as they can, and this rain has slowed guys down here again, but yesterday guys were out and going again. So about 30% of the soybean crop planted. Guys have just nicely started going on that, and we've got about 80% of the field pea crop in, and probably, you know, by the end of this week, the majority or whatever is going to be planted is going to be in for the pea crop. So if we can get a few more dry days here, I could see by the end of this weekend and middle of next week, we could have a fair bit of our crop planted. Was up in the Rivers area this past week, and there's just a crop of wheat that was sown fairly early, and it's definitely coming up. And you can see rows already. A little different type of land and growing conditions there. It gets dry fairly fast, so these crops were in early. This was taken south of Souris. Canola crops are starting to come up. We've got fairly good germination right now. A little bit spotty in places. This rain is going to help. The winds before the rain definitely dried things out to where the seed was. So the rain that we received over the weekend in the southwest is definitely going to help, that's for sure. And peas are starting to come up. Some of the early planted peas are up already, and coming up fairly good. Good germination looks like so far. Don't look like to be too many major issues with germination. So, you know, right now crop is coming up fairly good with you know, few problems out there. And I think the big thing next is going to be watching for weed control. A little bit of a weeds update. There is a lot of weeds starting to germinate out there. We've had it pretty good for the longest time here, where there's been very few weeds coming, just your little bit of volunteer canola. But over this past, you know, 2 or 3 days here, a lot of the seedlings are starting to come through. And I think it's something that we're going to definitely have to start dealing with now. It's a situation where you look at, and here's a field of canola stubble from last year, and you can see that there's definitely going to be an issue where burn-off will be important now before or after seeding, before the crop comes up, to get control of this canola. If you look a little bit closer, you can see a lot of that canola is starting to go to the 2-leaf stage. Some of it is in the 2-leaf and some just in the 1-leaf, but definitely starting to grow fairly fast, and is going to become a fairly major weed in the next little while here. So I believe burn-off is something that we're going to have to keep on top of, even if we're going to have to slow the drill down a bit, just to make sure we get control of some of the weeds that are going to be coming. Last week I showed dandelions that were starting to get, you know, on the larger side, so guys that didn't take care of their winter annuals, cleavers are starting to come. And you know, just a thing where we were pretty good for a while because very few weeds coming because of the growing conditions. Now that the soil's warmed up and we get a couple of warm days, these weeds are definitely coming, and I think we'll need to keep on top of them. Otherwise, we'll have some pretty major issues when we go to in-crop weed control. Just a little bit of a slide on rainfall over the past week. This is the total rainfall for from May 13th to May 20th, and you can see that some areas in the northern part of South Parkland area, Shoal Lake, Bertle, received little to no rainfall, and then as you got farther south to the border, you got down into that Killarney area where we're getting reports of some of the higher amounts of rainfall. So the system definitely tracked the border, and a lot of those areas into the eastern part of Manitoba, where you're hearing of large amounts of rainfall in those areas as well. So some people are dealing with too much moisture right now, and some people in the southern part, or northern part of the area here are still are looking for some moisture actually. Last week I showed the growing degree day, or this chart here, which gives us temperature and rainfall over the past 8 days, as well as the seasonal summary on growing degree days, corn heat units, and rainfall. And since May the 1st, and last week when I showed this, I made a point of looking at the growing degree days and just showing that last week we were probably, a lot of these were closer to 70% of our normal growing degree days. And this week you can see we've definitely jumped up to getting closer to, that 80 to 100%, and some areas higher. So we definitely have improved that way, which is good, because we are going to need things to warm up and heat up to get the crops going and move us along. I guess with that, that's going to end my update. We have a few presenters today, so I didn't want to take too long. So we'll turn it over now to Holly, and she's going to talk a little bit about seed treatment. So Linda, if you want to turn it over to Holly.
Okay, Holly, you need to click the button Show My Screen. There you go. Okay, we can see your presentation, so whenever you're ready, go ahead.
Great. All right, good morning, everyone, and thanks, Lionel, for inviting me to speak today. So I'm just going to do a pretty short presentation on seed treatment in cereals and why they're important and when they're important. So I'll get right into it. So what's the issue with cereals and seedling diseases? With seed treatments, you're looking for protection from seed-borne as well as soil-borne pathogens. However, if you're using clean seed, the soil-borne pathogens are really the only ones you're worried about. And since I like to assume that people are using clean seed, I'm going to be mostly focusing on the soil-borne pathogens. However, some seed-borne pathogens that you may be concerned with include seed-borne fusariums. So if you had some saved seed that had higher levels of FTK, there may be some issues with fusarium on the seed, as well as smuts and bunts. However, the soil-borne pathogens that we are concerned with cause seedling blight, stamping off, early season root rots, and the different pathogens here are fusarium species, pythium species, Kaskiw sativus, and then this long one that I don't know how to say, so I just call it the take-all pathogen. And the thing about these different pathogens is they are fairly endemic in our soils, except for maybe the take-all one. But these three pathogens are most likely in the soils every year and most likely infect your crop to some level. To whether or not you actually see any effects of it depends on when they affected and the environmental conditions, but they are in the soils. So they are out there, and if everything lined up, they could become a problem. So some symptoms of seedling diseases and damping off. You can see here that generally you may not see distinct symptoms, but it's more of a just reduced stand. So you don't have as much emergence maybe, or maybe some of the seedlings are dying off after they've emerged. And generally it's hard to see unless you have a comparison here. So this is obviously a small plot trial, where on the right-hand side you have a healthy stand, and on the left we have an infected stand. So if you just saw this out in the field, you may not realize it right away that you actually are having an issue with seedling diseases. However, if you do have some seedlings that haven't emerged and then become affected, you may see some symptoms on the hypocotyl, for example, or the epicotyl. And you can see here we have a healthy one looking white, and this one sorry. And this one, whoops, sorry, obviously has some necrosis, and you can see there's even some pinching here. So this plant is obviously not going to make it very far, whereas this one looks a lot more healthy. So some information about these different pathogens. This is actually their optimal environment for root rot, because these pathogens can also all cause root rot. And I did say early season root rot is something you can protect against with seed treatments. However, they can cause root rot all season long. However, their optimal environments are basically the same here. So they like cold soils for Pythium, and it likes it especially wet. So Pythium is actually a water mold. The wetter the soil is, the better chance that you're going to have an issue with Pythium potentially. Fusarium does like soils a bit warmer and can handle a bit drier conditions as well. The Takal pathogen likes those cool soils, wet. It also likes alkaline soils. And then Kaskiw sativus likes warm, moist soil. But you do notice here that they all require some sort of moisture. If you if the soils is really dry, chances are there isn't going to be a huge issue with these seedling diseases. Also note here the alternate hosts. So with Pythium and Fusarium, there's a wide host range, including pulses, cereals, and canola, and that obviously is a big reason why they are so endemic in our soils. There's really no way to rotate away from this pathogen. And then with the Takal and Kaskiw sativus, basically the main hosts are cereals and grasses. So why do we use seed treatments? I just took some quotes I found online from different areas that are promoting seed treatments. So promote seedling establishment and help reduce yield and quality losses, protect seed viability and inhibit the invasion of fungal pathogens causing seed rot and seedling blight. Basically, we use seed treatments to help get crops off to a good start. It's important to note, though, that this will not cure a poor seed lot. So if you do have a seed lot that had high FDK, it may help, but it's not going to cure it. You will still see an issue with things like seedling disease and seedling blight. So when do we use seed treatments? Well, first of all, if you do have an inferior seed lot, but hopefully you don't, so you could use them when there was poor planting conditions. So it could be too cold, and when it's too cold, seed germination is slowed. So this is something that maybe we saw last year for those that really went in and planted really early last year, because the snow was gone and we could see dirt, so we went out there and planted, but the seed took a long time to germinate. So it was too cold, and there can be an issue when your seed takes so long to germinate that there's just more time for a pathogen to come in and infect. Too dry. So I mentioned that most of these pathogens aren't active when it's terribly dry. However, when it is too dry, it's tempting to plant deeper. And therefore, seedlings do take longer to emerge, so there's a better chance that a pathogen can come in if we do get some moisture in that time. As well, the seed is planted deeper. It has to travel through more of the soil, obviously, before it emerges, and there's a better chance it could come into contact with one of these pathogens. Too wet, obviously, is conducive for most of these pathogens. And also in a high residue situation, especially with a cereal residue situation, there's a better chance that the seedling will come into contact with the pathogen. But isn't there a limited danger of seedling blights? And that's kind of what we're talking about today, about we're planting at late May, soils are a lot warmer. Are we still worried about seedling blights as much? It is a seedling disease. When you're using a seed treatment, you're protecting against seedling diseases. So after the seedling stage, the plant will not suffer damage from seedling blights. Root rots, on the other hand, can infect all season long, but the more roots a plant has, the less effects of a root rot will be noticed. So I mentioned before that a lot of these pathogens likely infect your plants each year, but if they're coming in late in the season when your plants have already established tons of roots, even if they take out a few of those roots, you aren't going to see any sort of damage on your plants. So it's really getting your plants past that seedling stage that are worried about these certain pathogens. Also, isn't there a limited activity of seed treatments? seed treatments become diluted once the seed germinates and is actively growing. So in most cases, seed treatments are no longer effective after the seedling emergence stage. And in addition, most seed treatments wear off approximately 2 weeks after planting. So the idea here is to get your plant to a stage where it's actively growing and can fend for itself within 2 weeks. And with the conditions how they are out there, where it has been a lot warmer, chances are you're going to be easily within this window. In other years where we plant a lot earlier, I know last year in this part of the province, especially canola sat in the ground for a long time before it got to that stage where it could fend for itself. But with conditions as they are right now, there's really going to be a limited window of time when your plant is in that seedling stage and really susceptible to these diseases. So that being said, and it may seem like I'm hinting towards that you could probably get away without using it, I do want to point out that if you're going to use it, you might as well use it correctly. So first of all, know what pathogens you're targeting. This can be part of where your seed lot came from, if you know there is some infection in that seed lot, as well as just knowing what you've had issues with in the past. Treat as closely to planting as possible. Use the correct rates and ensure good coverage. Well, these things are obviously important if you're using a seed treatment really in any crop, but especially if you're treating on the farm. These are things you have to make sure that you're doing correctly. Also, it's important to note, I do get questions about this sometimes, whether there are negative impacts from seed treatments, whether the seed treatment can somehow get into the seed and cause some sort of seed damage. And there are very few studies that show that, and the ones that do show that are typically with hulless barley, but for things like spring wheat, for example, generally we don't see negative impacts from seed treatments. So that's basically all I had. So I don't know if the moral of that story was that maybe this year you could get away for not using a seed treatment in your spring cereals. You know, if we really feel like it's such going to be a small window of time. A small window of time when your seed is in that really susceptible stage, or when that plant is in that really susceptible seedling stage, as opposed to other years where you really need that seed treatment to get your plant off to that great start. Chances are that this year it's already going to get off to a good start. So maybe this is the year that you could get away with not using a seed treatment, assuming you have a good, clean seed lot. Some more information, though, that this link I have here, Montana State University has done a small grain seed treatment guide, and they actually go through the different products and rate them for the different diseases. So if you want to check that out, you absolutely should. Some of the products, obviously, they have in the U.S. and we don't have here. Some of them just have different names. However, they have the active ingredient listed, so you should be able to figure out what we have here. And also, you can contact me at the Crop Knowledge Center in Carmen. I have my email address and my phone number here if you have any questions.
Holly, I do have a question.
Go ahead.
Okay, I do have a question, Holly.
Sure.
Will a seed treatment improve seed growth with faster germination?
I personally don't think so. I know there is, with all fungicides, they talk about other plant health benefits, but I wouldn't say that you should use a seed treatment solely for that reason. So if you feel like there isn't a disease issue, I wouldn't throw on a seed treatment just because there might be faster emergence. Because in conditions like we're going to have in the next couple of weeks, I don't think you're going to have a problem with slow emergence.
Okay, thank you, Holly. That's all the questions that I have right now. Lionel, did you have any other questions?
Yeah, Holly, I just have one actually. You mentioned that to try to treat as close as you can to seeding. Is there a timeline for the seed treatment? So let's just say a guy treated some last week or beginning of last week, and the rain's going to keep him out of the field for a couple of weeks or even 10 days. Is there a timeline for treated seed, or is there something we should be concerned about there?
Well, I think some of the labels maybe actually list if there is a specific timeline, but I would think 10 days up to 2 weeks, it shouldn't be an issue.
Okay. Good. Well, thanks, Holly.
No problem.
And I guess, Linda, what we'll do next is we're going to go right into John Gavloski's presentation. So if you wanted to turn it over to John.
Okay, thanks. You can hear me at that end, can you?
Yes, we can, loud and clear. Go ahead.
Okay, great. Okay, so I'm going to cover a few different things. Lionel's asked me to cover seed treatments with regard to wireworms, and I will touch on flea beetles, how seed treatments work there, and also where we're at with wireworms and flea beetles, what we're currently seeing, and what the situation for this year is shaping up to be. And I'll also touch on very briefly insects that potentially blow in, such as diamondback moth and aster leafhopper, and what we are seeing or not at this point. So I'm going to start with wireworms. And just as a really quick refresher on what we're talking about with wireworms. So they're the larvae of click beetles. This is a click beetle on the right side of your screen. And they can be anywhere from a very, very pale yellow to almost a deep yellow-orange color, the larva. And they can be tiny or they can be a good inch or so long. So they can vary quite a bit because they live for a few years in the soil as larvae. So far, I haven't had anybody call me and with a situation where they've had high wireworms this year yet, but it is early, and until crops start coming up, we're often not aware of what's there. The only calls I've had so far are a couple of people who are finding what they described as white worms in the soil, and they can be wireworm shaped, but they will have no legs at all, and they will wiggle quickly when you touch them, and those are a fly larva that eat wireworms and earthworms and other things. So again, as far as inquiries go, it's just been the good guys that people have been reporting so far. When you're looking for wireworms, wireworms do not come above the ground. They live below the ground all day as larvae. So unless you're digging around, you won't see them. So if you do start seeing bare patches, areas where the crops are coming up with some of the leaves being a little shredded, do a bit of digging and see if potentially it's wireworms that are doing that. Now regarding seed treatments and wireworms, Holly talked a lot about the disease side of things and when they're recommended or not. With wireworms, really a lot will depend on the history of what's been happening in your fields. Wireworms as larvae will live several years in the soil before they emerge as the beetle that I showed. So if you had wireworms that were a problem in a particular field last year, there's a decent chance that you will have a high population this year unless somehow they were taken out, which currently is hard to do. So base a lot of it on history of the field and what you were seeing in previous years. If you have not had wireworm issues in your area recently, you may not need to put out the extra money for having a cruiser or a Raxo WW. If you have had some wireworm problems, seed treatments really are the only way to go, aside from trying to get your crop to germinate and grow quickly when it's young. Regarding the seed treatments that are out there right now, I mentioned seed treatments are the only option. There are no foliar sprays for wireworms. You can't go and spray anything that's going to kill them because they don't come above the ground. So right now, aside from potatoes, seed treatments are the only option. And the names you'll be familiar with are Cruiser, Raxo WW, and Poncho in corn, which is the same thing really. They're all the same chemical grouping, so they're all very similar chemistries. Now, the way these chemistries work is they essentially intoxicate the wireworms. They're not outright killing them. The wireworms, when they encounter these chemicals, they become, the best way to describe it is intoxicated or sick. They will stop feeding. And while they're not seeding, your crop is getting off to a decent start. So they will work well at preventing damage to the crop. What they won't do is give you high kill of wireworms. So if you had a field last year that had say a cruiser or a Raxol or something on it, don't make the assumption that the wireworms in that field are all dead because you had a seed treatment there last year. They may not be. So you might want to use bait balls or do some digging to see what's present in the field. But again, these seed treatments intoxicate the wireworms. They don't outright kill them. So be careful with that. And again, use your knowledge of the history of your field to make your decisions. I mentioned, aside from the seed treatments, seeding practices. It's really the only other way we have of managing wireworms. I guess the caution is if you know wireworms are a concern, a potential concern, and you're not going to be using seed treatment with an insecticide, anything you can do to get quick germination and quick early growth will be helpful. So seeding into soils that are warm and moist will be helpful. Maybe seeding a little bit on the shallower side might be helpful as well. And if you know you potentially could have a concern, increasing the seeding rate a little bit can also help to reduce the overall level of damage. Okay, I'm going to move into flea beetles. Unless anyone's got any questions at this point on the wireworms. We're good on the wireworm side? Okay, we'll
Yes,
move
go
into flea
ahead,
beetles
John.
then. Okay, so for flea beetles, I'm just going to point out a couple different types of flea beetles we've got in Manitoba. Actually, there's 10 species that will feed on canola, but really only 2 of them that you see a lot of. On the screen on the right here, the 2 flea beetles near the top, you'll notice they've both got some yellow stripes going down the side of their body. This is called the striped flea beetle. It's the one that we're currently seeing the most of. The flea beetle at the bottom, no yellow stripes. This one's called the crucifer flea beetle. That's the one you're going to see more of over the next, say, 3 weeks. The different species are a little bit different in their biology and behavior. The striped ones are very early season species. Last year they were actually out in late March. This year it was more like late April when they started coming out. So early in the season, late April, early May, the population is almost all striped flea beetles. And then somewhere around early to mid-May, you do start getting the crucifer flea beetles coming out. Right now, we're still, I would say, over 50% of the population striped, smaller proportion crucifer, and that will change. Like I said, in about 2 weeks, you'll notice there's not a lot of the striped ones around anymore. It'll be a lot of the solid black ones. There is a little bit of a difference in the way the seed treatments work on them. Any given insecticide, if you apply it to several different types of, say, beetles, it's not going to control all species the exact same way and to the exact same level. And that's the case here. You get a little bit better control of crucifer flea beetle than you do striped flea beetle with the seed treatments that we're currently using. It doesn't mean the chemicals don't work on the striped flea beetles. They do. But the rate of kill will be a little bit less with striped than it will with crucifer. It's not a resistance thing. There's no resistance in the population. That's just the way the chemicals work. Okay, now the activity of the flea beetles. Right now, a day like today is going to be a good day for the flea beetles for flying and moving into fields, providing it's not too windy. As a general guideline, research done in Manitoba back in the 80s, they found that 14 degrees Celsius was sort of the general temperature where flea beetles would start flying. So over the winter, the flea beetles are concentrated in shelter belts and areas outside your field. Once we start getting above 14 degrees, start moving out of those shelter belts into your field, and that movement continues right into end of May, sometimes even early June, they're still moving out of shelter belts into fields. So that's happening now. Like I said, any day above 14 degrees, that movement will be occurring. And they'll be moving around within and between fields, too. The other thing that will affect their movement is wind and wind speed. They don't fly much on windy days. Windy days, you'll notice they kind of hunker down. They're on the plants potentially feeding, often on the underside of the cotyledons or leaves, or on the stems. So if it's too windy, it won't be a good flying day. So days where you're above about 14, 15 degrees and it's calm, those are the days that they're going to be flying. And if you're getting to the point where your seed treatments might be starting to wear thin, then you have to start watching those fields carefully. That being said, most people this year probably aren't going to have to worry about their seed treatments wearing out until well into June, just because of the late seeding. For anyone who did get some earlier seeding in, as a general guideline, I suggest after about 3 weeks, start watching the seedlings. We had years like last year where people seeded and 3 weeks later things were still in the cotyledon stage or one-leaf stage, and there was a lot of feeding damage happening and foliar sprays were needed. So keep an eye on things, especially if you did manage to get your seed in early. Staging, I mentioned about last year, the crops were still at the cotyledon one-leaf stage when the flea beetles were still very actively feeding. As a general guideline, once we get beyond having 2 or 3 true leaves expanded, the plant can compensate quite well for the flea beetle feeding. It's getting into that stage that's critical. So if you're seeding into warm ground that's got moisture, the crop gets off to a good, quick start, the seed treatments alone may be all you need. It's years when things aren't so ideal and the crop struggles to get beyond that second leaf stage. That's when you need to be doing potentially more than just relying on a seed treatment. As a general guideline too, if you are looking at, I'm going to go back a slide actually, if you're looking at your seedlings and you notice a few little pits like in the slide on your right here, don't get too excited. That's normal. The flea beetles do have to take a bite and get some of the seed treatment in them to get killed. So you will see the odd pit. This level of pitting does nothing to overall yield and your stand. Things will be growing quite normally with mild pitting like this. This is very mild actually. Situation like this is a bit more major. And this is obviously situations like this. If it's been more than 3 weeks since seeding and you're seeing this type of thing happening in the field, that's when you would consider doing a foliar spray potentially. But minor pitting like this, just ignore it. It won't be doing serious damage. So as a general guideline, if you are having to evaluate and make that kind of decision, do I spray or not, 25% defoliation is the level that is suggested as the threshold. It's a nominal threshold. It's based on our best guess, based on the research that's out there. So yeah, use that 25%. If you've got a few pits like in these photos here, that's quite tolerable. Even 20% the plant can tolerate, but once you get above that, once you get into this 30-40% range, that's when you would get economic damage. As far as seeding date goes, this year there's a lot of later seeding. There's been a few studies on seeding date and flea beetle damage. What are the risks? One in Alberta, a study in North Dakota, and a study in Manitoba. And I'll start with the Manitoba study. What they found in that particular study was that earlier seeding dates, the plants tended to suffer more damage by flea beetles. What was happening was basically the plants were germinating and in the very vulnerable stages when the flea beetles were peaking. So later seeding this year, we may be able to escape some of that damage. And the other thing that sometimes happens is the plants just grow quicker when they're seeded later into warmer ground. So that can have an effect too. The study in North Dakota found the same thing. They had more flea beetle injury in the earlier seeding dates in their study. And Alberta, it was a mixed bag. The earlier seeding reduced the damage in southern Alberta, but increased it in the central and northern area of Alberta. So again, we may escape some of it this year because of the later seeding, especially if you've got Helix or Prosper or Acceleron or something on your seed. It might be easier for the plants to escape that, the flea beetle seeding. But again, keep looking, especially if the crop is struggling to grow. For anybody who is using zero tillage or minimal tillage in the field, just a brief note here. A study in Alberta by Lloyd Osdell in the late 90s, they found that with zero tillage, there was much less flea beetle damage per plant. So this is flea beetle damage, these bars here, and the level of damage was much less in the zero till plots than in their conventional till plots. The reason being, flea beetles like hot, dry, open conditions. They don't like a damp, humid, cooler environment. So given the choice between a field with a lot of debris, such as your zero till field, and something more open, such as the conventional tillage, they're going to be in the field with the conventional tillage. Very quick update here on insects that blow in. We've got our network of traps out once again for diamondback moth. That's these pheromone-baited delta traps. So a lot of the FPAs in your area will have them out, and I know the Canola Council's got some out. So far, we're not really finding much. Our high count so far is 8 from a trap near Steinbach. We've caught 2 here near Carmen. The 2 we caught were in good shape, which leads me to believe that we've had a few overwintering survivals. They can survive in low numbers here, diamondback moth, but not in great numbers. So unless we get a big movement of them on winds from the south, they're not likely to be a threat. So far, again, no evidence of any big movements of diamondback moth our way, and there's been no reports from the states bordering us either, so we're pretty safe in that regard. And same story for aster leafhopper. I know it was a big story last year, but so far there's been no evidence of them being here, and there's been no reports of them from the northern and north central states yet. So very different year this year, and we've seen that before, where one year aster yellows and aster leafhopper is a big concern, and the next year it barely shows up. Now, there's still lots of time. Things can change. But right now, the risk is low because the states beneath us, North Dakota, South Dakota, Minnesota, nobody's reporting any aster leafhopper levels that are of significance, and no one's reporting any movement of them on the wind currents. I know there were some watches and alerts that went out last week because we had south winds move into Manitoba. Yes, we do have these wind patterns that potentially can bring in these insects, but the good news is they didn't. And so I just want to get that out there, that just because we've had some south winds does not mean we've got aster leafhoppers and diamondback moth. They're not being found yet. We'll keep you posted what we find. I converse with my counterparts in North Dakota, South Dakota, Minnesota, those states on a regular basis. We have every 2 weeks a conference call. We compare notes. And so we'll keep you posted if anything is moving in. And additionally, we get maps of wind patterns, and we can have a look at those and see what wind patterns are coming our way and what potentially would be on them. Just a little bit of an advertisement here before I sign off. We need cutworms again for a study we're doing on parasites. We're trying to figure out what regulates our cutworm populations here in Manitoba. Barb Sharanowski at the University of Manitoba, she's the one rearing the cutworms and seeing what pops out of them. But we need cutworms for this study. So if you do come across a lot of cutworms in a field, a couple options, give somebody a call, myself or Barb Sharanowski or an FPA or someone, and we can get some collected for this study. Or collect a sample yourself and you can get it sent in. we'd love to have your cutworms, and again, we'll see what pops out of them. And last year, Barb did find quite a bit of our cutworms did have parasites. There was a species called Cotesia that was quite present and doing a good job regulating the populations to some degree. So we'd like to learn more about these parasites and figure out how we can enhance their levels too. So maybe I'll end with that and take any questions if anybody has any.
I don't have any questions at this point, John. Lionel, did you have anything?
Nothing right now. Thanks, John. You covered everything that I was hoping you'd cover real well there. So I don't know if you have time to hang on for the rest, and then maybe if there's something that pops up at the end, you could be there. But I guess
yeah, I'll hang around in case.
Good. Thanks, John. With that, Linda, maybe we'll turn it over to Carol. Carol is from Manitoba Habitat Heritage Corporation, and she's going to give us talk about some of the tips for planting the trees we're getting this spring.
Thanks, Lionel. And as Lionel had mentioned earlier, the planting season is delayed quite substantially this year as a result of the conditions we've had. And so we thought it'd be kind of timely with the trees arriving here in the next week or two to kind of go over some of the considerations that should be made with regards to the stock that's arriving. I'm not really going to get into the do's and don'ts of planting themselves, but more kind of go over some handling techniques and practices that will maximize the growth potential of the seedlings as a result of the reduced growing season that they're going to have this year. First and foremost, once you receive the seedlings, they're going to arrive, depending on your nursery source, they're going to arrive in various forms, whether they're going to be in the boxes or bundled in small packages or in larger packages with wrap. And ideally what you want to do once you receive your seedlings is to store them immediately in a dark, cool space, whether it be in a corner of your garage where it stays relatively cool, or you have a shed with exposed floor, that can be a good suitable spot. Or if you're even storing them on the north side of buildings outside, that at least keeps them from being exposed to extreme variations while you're waiting for the right time to get them in the ground. If you're planting within the next 3 to 5 days upon receiving your seedlings, you can leave them in the original packaging. You don't really need to open them up and expose them and baby them along. Just leave them intact. However, if you're going to be creeping up to that 5+ days, you may want to then start looking at the stock and checking to see that there's not excess moisture building up within the packaging. If so, you want to maybe slit it and get some airflow through there so you don't get the root mold developing on the root systems. Or in some cases, particularly with your spruce bundles, they have a tendency to dry out. And so you may just want to keep an eye on them and ensure that they're staying relatively moist. One thing don't recommend is that you pull them out of the package and then throw them in water. This significantly compromises the seedling's ability to grow, and in some cases will suffocate the seedlings to the point where they won't perform at all once they're planted in the ground. What some people do on the day of planting is they will take them out of the packages, and if it's a particularly windy day or a particularly hot day, they will throw them in a bucket of water prior to planting, which is acceptable as long as you don't leave the seedlings in the water for more than 4 hours. It seems to be based on research, once you hit that 4+ hour range, the performance of the seedlings is significantly compromised. But once you receive them, don't put them in the water. The exception to that rule will be those who receive willow and hybrid poplar cuttings. And I would anticipate that this year anybody who had ordered these two species will likely see cuttings. So this will be kind of the form that you'll receive them in. They just will literally look like sticks. And what you're going to want to do when you receive them is keep them in the packaging as you would if they were rooted stock. And at the time What you want to, however, take into consideration is give them time to be placed into water, because that will be critical to ensure that they will successfully produce roots. What you're going to want to do is, once you get your cuttings, is you want to ensure that you orient them so that you know which is upwards versus downwards. So in this case, you're just going to want to take a look at the buds, and the narrower portion of the bud indicates that's the upward direction of the cutting. Here you can see an enlarged bud. And what that means is it's not absolutely critical if you accidentally plant your cuttings upside down. Both willow and poplar have the ability to kind of adjust for that and perform, but because we're looking at a reduced growing season, you kind of want to maximize their growing potential. So if you can orient them correctly, then you reduce that timeline that they're going to need to kind of readjust themselves and get themselves growing correctly. So once you know the orientation, you do want to soak them, whether you throw them in a bucket of water or a tub or whatever you have, and just the bottom half of the cuttings is all that really needs to be submerged in the water. Ideally, you want to give them at least 3 days to soak, even up to 7. If you're in a real time crunch and you really want to get them in the ground, at least give them 24 hours, and hopefully the soil conditions are moist enough that that'll then encourage them to continue producing roots. And what you're doing when you're putting them in water is you're actually stimulating the stem material to actually produce a root system. And so you can see here in the corner here, this is the early stages of the roots. And so you're going to see white growth off of the stems. What you can see is over time you will see that if they remain in water, that you'll get a quite extensive root system. Ideally, if you're going to be planting in a shelter belt scenario, you don't want to leave your cuttings in water to the point where you actually start to see roots developing. So that's why the 3 to 5 day window is ideal, because what you've done is you've soaked them long enough that internally there's going to be root development, but you don't have actual roots forming on the outside. Because the problem is once you start to have roots developing on the outside, when you go to plant, those roots will either be damaged or sloughed off during the planting process. And so then the plant has to then take whatever energy reserve is still remaining in that stem and produce a second root system. And that will then compromise its ability to also flesh out the buds that's going to be needed to get your above ground growth. I get a lot of questions as to how deep do you plant your cuttings, and ideally you want to plant them as deep as you can get them. And in this first photo you can see here, here's an example of some cuttings here. You want to get them so that the tips are relatively flush with the ground surface. Whether you want to leave an inch or so exposed, that's fine, but you can see here that's where they've got cuttings here on this particular one. You can see what the tree does. This is a hybrid poplar, is it'll flesh out the healthiest bud closest to the tip, and it'll sacrifice the rest of the cutting. So you may as well get as much of it into the ground, because whatever is in contact with the soil will then continue producing root system. And if you get a really healthy root system in these cuttings, then you've got a greater survival rate come fall and through the winter, which is critical for these types of plantings during the first growing season. And here you can see, here's just an example of more cuttings and the success. This is within a couple of, this would be 3 weeks after planting. You can see that they start producing quite a bit of growth. The actual planting techniques, I think everybody has a good handle on how to plant a tree. The one thing I thought I'd like to highlight on is weed control, and particularly on this year where you have probably 4 to 5 weeks shorter growing season. A lot of these seedlings, particularly your hybrid poplars, those that are very aggressive, don't like any form of competition, and weeds have a pretty significant impact on the overall long-term productivity of your trees if they become too aggressive. And one consideration, I've been fielding quite a few questions with regards to plastic mulch. It's a a fairly effective means to at least maintain a very clean environment immediately around your seedlings, because weeds within that 3 to 5 years, if they get too aggressive and are competing with your trees, you can compromise the overall growth performance of this tree for its duration of life. And so particularly if the goal is to get tree cover, you don't want to do so. So the question is, when do you apply plastic mulch? Well, typically in this region we see plastic mulch installed after the trees themselves have been planted. You can see here in the background, here's a row of hybrid poplar that have been planted. And what they will do is you can see there's bulges in the plastic, there's trees already in the ground, so they overlay the plastic on top of the trees, and then someone will come in behind and just pull the trees out of the plastic, slit a hole and pull them through. Questions are, when should you put the plastic mulch on? Ideally this year you're going to want to focus on getting the trees in the ground and get them going, and then come in afterwards and plant and install the plastic. You can install the plastic immediately. If the trees are planted correctly, they'll have a pretty good anchor in the ground, and so there's no tendency of seeing them lifting up or being pulled out while you're installing the plastic. If you can't put the plastic on immediately, what you want to avoid is just seeing a really well-established weed bed when you go to install the plastic. Because as you can see here, the edges are anchored with soil, and so the cleaner the soil is, the better the edges are secured and the less likely that you're going to see any compromises or exposures of those edges. And unfortunately with plastic mulch, if there's an edge exposed and you get a significant wind, it will then ultimately lift the plastic, and particularly in the first year, take out all the trees that you've planted as well. Just to give you an idea of the importance of weed control, here's a hybrid poplar shelter belt that's approximately 10 years of age, and you can see that it had a bit of a battle with the weeds, and as a result you got a section here that's ultimately completely declined, and you can see here the crown is very thin and is likely going to succumb to what looks like is probably septoria. As a comparison, this is a similar aged shelter belt, hybrid poplar again, and you can see that they did use plastic mulch within the tree row. And then what a lot of people will do is then, as a secondary weed control measures, they'll plant grass in between their tree rows and use grass as a way to keep the site clean, and also it keeps maintenance a little bit more manageable. So that's all I really wanted to talk about with regards to the tree handling during the planting process, or prior to. At this time of year, we haven't really seen or had any concerns with regards to disease yet. It's still a bit too early. The one thing that has been noted is that people are starting to see spruce trees and pine trees and even cedar trees browning. And that's not uncommon. That's fairly typical, particularly when you have, say, in March and April, you start to get some significant winds. And the needles themselves, because they stay on the tree, they lose moisture through the winter. And eventually they get to a point where they start to, the moisture is significant, or there's significant moisture loss in the needles. However, because the ground is still frozen, the trees are not able to replenish the moisture that's lost. So then you kind of see what is referred to as winter browning. And not uncommon in your evergreens, particularly cedar. The other thing that we've noted is that cedar trees that have been wrapped in burlap have browned. And there's a bit of a debate whether you should or shouldn't be putting burlap around your trees. Burlap in itself is effective in trying to minimize extreme exposures to the elements through the winter, and so it's ideal to put on in certain environments or settings. However, you want to install it correctly, and this is a picture that demonstrates an incorrect application of burlap. You don't want the burlap to be in contact with the needles of the trees. You want to actually give a little bit of space between the burlap and the cedar trees themselves. So that way the burlap is actually performing its function, it's minimizing exposure to the elements, and you're not compromising the microclimate surrounding the needles of the cedar. So if you're going to install burlap, if you can just give a little bit of a gap, that'll alleviate the browning tendency that often is seen, particularly when you remove burlap. If you're also applying or utilizing burlap, don't remove it too soon in the spring. Make sure that the frost is starting to come out of the ground when you do remove your burlap, so that way when you remove it and if the tree starts to lose excess moisture, it's able to draw it in from the ground and replenish whatever it's losing. And that's basically it for trees right now. If you have any questions, the Prairie Shelterbuild Center has a toll-free number that's really effective for answering tree planting questions and even disease and insect issues. The Manitoba Forestry Association out of Winnipeg is also another source for tree questions. And then myself, I'm always able to answer any questions that come in. And
Thank you. Thank you, Carol. I don't have any questions right now. Lionel, did you have any?
Nothing right now, no. Thanks, Carol. That was great, great information. And Linda, if you would turn the screen over to me, what I can do is finish up today and get into the weed of the week. And the weed of the week this week is cleavers. I was getting a few calls regarding cleavers, and it's starting to show up in fields, and producers are starting to ask about controlling and what they should be looking at doing. So I figured it would be a good one to talk about today. So cleavers can be a very competitive weed, causing significant yield loss. It creates difficulties at harvest, and it also reduces seed quality in canola and flax. And there's just a picture of a seedling cleaver, and I'll get into the plant description right away. So cleavers are an annual or a winter annual. They reproduce by seed. It prefers damp, moist soil, so usually grows fairly well in grain-producing land. It can grow anywhere from 2 to 4 feet tall, and it tends to wind itself around other plants. And when flowers are white and small and produce in the axils of the upper leaf, so you can see where you get your upper leaf whorl here, and you can see right in the axil is where they're producing their flower. So what does the plant look like? Well, if you look at the leaves of the plants, they're in a whorl, so that means they're coming out of the same area on the stem in each location as they move up the stem. There could be anywhere between 4 to 8 leaves, depending on the size of the plant. The stems are square. That's a dead giveaway for them, as well as they have on the corners of the stems, they have hooks or little hairs that are pointing downwards, which enable them to cling on to things. So when the animals are walking through fields, or you're walking through the field checking the field, it's easy for them to cling on to your clothing or onto animals' hair, and this way that's how they get moved around the fields quite easily. The seeds are gray-brown color and rough and bristly. You can see from the picture. They are prolific plant producers, seed producers, because they can produce about 3,500 seeds. Because of their size, and if you look at the picture, you can see they are very similar in size to canola. They can and have become a real problem with canola and canola seed, and so they're basically impossible to clean out. The seed can stay dormant in the soil, in dry soil, and can remain viable for up to 3 years. So if you've got the problem, just controlling it 1 year doesn't mean you've eliminated the problem. An important thing is the seeds remain viable when eaten by animals. So basically, a lot of times we think that through manure that the seeds would become they're not going to germinate anymore, and meanwhile these ones will. And plant and seeds can attach themselves to animals and equipment and can be moved around fairly easily. So some control tips. Weed-free seed. So canola seed, and I guess this is why it's spread quite a bit throughout Manitoba here. It used to be a weed that was mainly kind of north of number 1 highway, and now we have it right through the southwest. And one of the issues was it was probably coming in seed, and we were probably getting cleavers in probably canola seed. All grades of pedigree seed must be free from cleaver seed, so basically any pedigree seed you're purchasing should be free of cleavers. The big thing with controlling cleavers is to control the winter annual, and I talked about that with dandelions last time, and the same with cleavers. If you control the winter annual, then you have a lot easier way of controlling the spring germinated ones in crop. If you don't control the winter annual, then by the time in-crop weed control comes around, you're going to have a large cleaver plant, and it's going to be harder to control and more expensive to control. The good thing about it is we do have a lot of products that are registered for in-crop control of cleavers. I guess the only issue we would have is we do have some issues with conventional canolas. Not many producers are growing conventional canolas anymore, but in conventional canolas we really don't have many products that are available to control cleavers in conventional canolas. So that's the weed of the week, and just a few notes to finish off today with. Regarding CCA credits, just a reminder, you can get CCA credits for through Growing Concerns. And if you're viewing the recorded webinars later, we need you to write a short summary of the topics and email it to us with the date of the webinar and your CCA number, so we can process your information and get you the credit through the process. This is our email and contact information, so myself and Linda in the office in Ceres here. And then our MAFRE FPAs in the Southwest and the South Parkland, and just listed them and their contact information. I'd like to thank our presenters today. We had a lot of really good information, so thanks to Holly and John and Carol. And Linda, is there any questions?
No, Lionel, I don't have any questions at this time.
Great. Okay. Well, I'd like to thank everybody for attending. And with that, I think we can end the webinar for today.